Charlie Belfontaine, and you're listening to the HomeBuyers Hour on WCPT AM 820, where the facts matter. In the studio with me, I got Patrick Loftus of Loftus Law. Remotely, we have Joey Matthews of the Federal Savings Bank. And our guest host today, we are going to get to those two in a little bit, but our guest expert is a partner of the Kaiser Group. He is the highest producing multifamily broker since 2014 and has sold more apartment buildings than any other broker in Chicago. He is a member of the Southside Community Investment Association and the Young Real Estate Professionals. His name is Noah Birk, and I'm pleased to welcome him as our guest expert this week on the HomeBuyers Hour. And if you don't mind, Noah, give us a quick rundown, say hi to somebody special to you, and tell us what's unique about Noah Birk and the Kaiser Group.
Well, first off, thanks for having me. Excited for the next hour or so. Give a shout out to my kids, Elijah, Harvey, Naomi.
Nice.
And what's special about Kaiser Group? We just sell apartment buildings just in Chicago. My team focuses almost exclusively on the south side, and then we've got another guy on our team that focuses exclusively on the west side, but we're all over the city.
How big is your team?
I think the Birk Sklar team, we have 8 of us total.
Nice. And that keeps everybody working. Are they all brokers, or does that include staff members as well?
Yep, we've got some guys on salary, some brokers, just a good mix.
Terrific. And Patrick Loftus, give us a little lowdown and wish everybody a Merry Christmas. Say hello.
Happy holidays.
Oh, my goodness. And if you're watching live on YouTube, Patrick does have the coolest hat in the room. I'll give him that much. But how do people get hold of you, Patrick?
You can call or text 773-632-8330.
Sounds exciting. And then my favorite mortgage broker of everybody in the entire world is Joey Matthews. And yes, Patrick's looking at me, rolling his eyes right now because I do say everyone's my favorite, I will confess, all right? But Joey, if you don't mind, give us a rundown of who you are, your company, your team. And I know there's been a whole lot going this last week in the finance world.
Yeah, so Joey Matthews, NMLS 1330694, the VA loan nerd, and the favorite mortgage dude of Charlie for the next 1 hour of my life. You can reach me at 630-235-2405, and find me on social media at the VA loan nerd across all platforms.
No, I love to hear that stuff for sure. But you know, I noticed that they're buying, or they're trying to build up our oil reserve. The Biden administration is doing that. And, you know, and I get it. I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'm not afraid to say so. But I really believe that, you know, when we had that crash in '08, that a lot of it had to do with the sudden spike in the gas prices that happened. Then we went from $2 to $4.50. And even right before the election, we had $4.50 a gallon of gas again. And now it seems, I just saw it in our neighborhood where it was under $3. Or no, under, it was
I
like
just saw $2.65.
Did you? So it was under $3. My wife was telling me about that as well. So what's your take? Does that have any effect on the real estate and how things are going?
I think that it will, because we're looking at how that affects inflation, right? So that's a big marker on inflation is energy costs, right? Because we have core CPI, and then we have the higher inflation markers like energy, food, things of that nature. So with that coming down, I would anticipate seeing CPI numbers come in lower than anticipated again next month.
And what does that mean again, CPI numbers? I'm sorry for my ignorance.
Consumer Price Index. So that's what inflation is called on the economic calendar, at least. But so last week, obviously, we saw inflation come in late again, 2 months in a row.
That's great.
Still in the sevens, and the Fed raised rates a 0.5% instead of a 0.75%, which is obviously a sign of them anticipating a slowing of increasing long term. We'll see what happens, but again, we're still over 7. That's a huge number when you're trying to get down to 3 and 2 and things of that nature. So we have time to see how things play out. I am still a believer that they have overcorrected. But I don't play into the fear game. I'm always a positive person. So, Nothing crazy going on this week. We'll have some jobless claims that tomorrow coming out. We had consumer confidence today, but nothing that's going to rock the markets really. Should be a slow week, and then we'll see what's going on next week.
Yeah, it looks like job numbers are good. I think I saw 3.7% unemployment, which, I mean, I don't know. I took a macroeconomics class in high school, AP at macroeconomics. Thank you very much. But as far as I know, the full employment, at least, well, I'm not going to tell you when I was in high school. It's a long time ago, but 5-6% is what was considered full employment. So, sounds like a strong job market to me.
Which I think means a lot. Patrick, I got a little bit of a question for you. So whenever we put on these shows and we want to get a good chance to get to know our guest expert and realize what they could bring to the show for the conversations, and then we find out what's super interesting, go from there, and maybe it is or it isn't. But when we were talking this morning, you were talking about the process of getting under contract. So when somebody's buying an apartment building in a larger, an investor basically, and I'd love to get yours and Noah's take on this, but can you go into detail again what you were talking about, what seems to be a common bad practice, I guess?
Well, I characterize it as a bad practice, and I take issue with one thing that you said there, is that maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not interesting. Of course it's interesting.
Sorry.
Charlie, jeez Louise.
This is why you're my favorite. Joey, you're out. Patrick's in.
It's
just don't get into mortgages.
He's a fickle mistress, this child.
That's for sure.
So it's a bad practice from my perspective because it has a tendency of wasting a lot of my time, a lot of the broker's time. But that is the practice of getting a property under contract at just about any price, knowing that post inspection, the buyer is going to try to get as much off the price as they can based on that inspection, with the intention effectively of, if they don't get enough off of that price, to just walk away, because they don't really have any skin in the game at that point, and it's really just a giant waste of time for everyone involved. Noah, maybe you can add, please, from your perspective, when you encounter this kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of like we spoke about a little bit this morning, I always like to say that it's not problems that kill deals, it's more surprises. So that kind of goes to, before a building goes under contract, one of the most important things is making sure that buyer has as much due diligence as you can give them up front. And you want to give them as much due diligence up front so that they have less surprises down the road.
And let me ask you real quick, what do you mean by you want to? Who is you? Is this the listing agent or the selling agent?
So you as a listing agent or as a broker in general, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller,
okay,
you want your buyer to be as informed as possible, and you want that to try to avoid any surprises down the road, because it's surprises that end up killing deals. So like we were just talking about, you'll often see a less experienced or less educated buyer kind of just randomly throwing out offers or making offers that are based on maybe things that they don't fully understand at that point in the deal. And so as they get deeper into the deal, maybe they uncover an unexpected thing, like perhaps it needs a new roof. And if they find out that it needs a new roof while they're under contract, it's going to lead to them asking for a large credit, and that large credit ask will lead to the deal dying.
Most of these roofs are pretty expensive. I mean, we're talking in, 20s. Maybe, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's depending on the size of the building. I mean, it can be anywhere from 20 to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how large the building is.
And what is help me understand how this whole process works. There's the investors call it the numbers. The numbers work or the numbers don't work. What are they talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately the reason why somebody would want to buy multifamily real estate is that they're looking for an investment, a return on their cash. So, if they have $100,000 to invest and they're wanting a 10% return on that, they're trying to figure out how this building is going to produce them $10,000 a year in income. And so by doing that, they need to look at the rent that's coming into the building. They need to look at all the expenses that the building has each month. And then they need to decide, how much CapEx, meaning things like the roof, things like the windows, things like the boiler, plumbing, electric, that could potentially go wrong or need to be replaced during their time of ownership. And when they look at the quote-unquote numbers, they're trying to make sure all of those things add up to make sure that they're going to achieve whatever the return is that they're anticipating.
We just had somebody type on. We do broadcast this. We do broadcast the show live on YouTube, Facebook. It runs across a few different streams. And I think this is a real estate agent. Her name is Anna Zuniga. And she goes, it shows how much you know too. And I don't quite know what she's going by that. Do either one of you two have an idea? I hope she's not criticizing me because I don't know anything when it comes to buying apartment buildings. All I know is what they're supposed to do and how to inspect them.
I'm not positive, but I mean, she may be alluding to, kind of what I was saying is that, by getting that due diligence up front, it shows that you as the broker understand how much you're getting those things out in front of somebody. So if you don't know to get them, the trailing 12, the T12 up front, that could be a problem down the road when the buyer perhaps sees a trailing 12 that wasn't in line with what their expectations were when they made that initial offer.
And I know you explained it to me, but what does trailing 12 mean?
So a trailing 12, a T12, as you'll hear a lot of people refer to it, is the previous 12 months of the income and expenses that a building generated. So it's really important for investors to see the trailing 12 or trailing 24, because a lot of people will, base that on the future of the building. If it produced X amount last year, it's likely to produce X amount next year, or perhaps it produced way less last year, and for whatever reason, I as an investor think that I can make certain changes that will make it produce more because I see inefficiencies in the data that's trailing.
Are there like certain percentages, and maybe Joey, Patrick, you could help him on this? Is there certain percentages, and I'm just going to throw this out there, that like the water bill should be no more than 2% of the gross revenue? Well, I'm making stuff up. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's always changing. I mean, especially with things like water, gas, electric. Those prices change year in and year out. You'll see a lot of people talk about an expense ratio, and that's kind of the total expenses per rent that you're getting in the building. And depending on the area that you're in, whether it's a really nice area or a more management intensive area, that expense ratio can be anywhere from 30% to up to 50% or maybe even more, depending on. There's a lot that goes into that, though. It's not a kind of foolproof sort of number.
Yeah, I would think that the number, as you alluded to just a moment ago, that is most important is the return on the investment. And I wonder, the return on the investment, are there differences between perhaps someone who is a smaller investor, maybe wants to get one or two buildings under management, as opposed to a larger investor? Would either of those types of investors be looking at different numbers in terms of what that needs to be?
Their expectations of what their cash-on-cash return is definitely going to vary depending on who the investor is. For instance, a lot of, if you're a very large investor, if you have $1 billion to invest, you may be very happy with like a 4% return and just to park it there and just wait. If you're doing this as your job and it's just, your one investment and you're actually expecting to live off of that income, you may be, looking for more like 20%. And that puts you in different areas of the country to invest, different product types, all sorts of different things. But even within, a product type, let's say I was buying a 100-unit building, and that 100-unit building produced, for easy numbers, produced $100,000 a year for the institutional level investor. And they're paying somebody to manage the building, they're paying a janitor to go in there and clean it, they're paying all of these things, and at the end of the day, they're left with $100,000 of money there for their investors. Maybe I, as an individual investor, can go into that and say, I'm going to manage this myself. And just by managing it myself, now that building to me makes me $115,000 a year. And I'm going to clean the building myself. I'm going to do the janitorial. And so now I don't pay a janitor. and now instead of $100,000, I'm managing it, so it's $115. I'm going to be the janitor, so it's $125 or whatever. And so like there's a lot of what we call soft costs that go into any deal that change drastically with management, depending on who's managing it and depending on how they manage it. The hard costs, though, things like gas, electric, water, those typically don't change much no matter who owns the building. They can a little bit, but the soft costs are where you can really make or break a deal.
Yeah, I was sharing with you earlier today, too, that we had an investor client of ours. He called me up and goes, well, something's changed with the water bill. It went up like $1,000 a month, and we need to go in there and find out where it's leaking at. And then he comes across and came back at me with the numbers don't work, with that. And to me, and again, I'm just going to share my naiveness of everything. Yeah, $1,000 seems a pretty small number when you're talking about a multifamily to whether something's going to work or not going to work. I mean, that's one unit rent almost, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, I mean, it all depends. Who $1,000 to one person could be a very meaningful amount of money.
Absolutely.
To somebody else, it could be a very meaningless amount of money. But if his margins are somewhat thin, and that takes him from a 10% cash on cash return down to a 6% cash on cash return just from that $1,000, that's a meaningful jump. 6 to 10, as opposed to if it's with much bigger numbers then.
Yeah, and if it's a 3-unit building, I would assume that the 1,000 is going to have a much greater impact on that return on investment as opposed to if it's a 30-unit building. But $1,000 is $1,000, and if your toilet's leaking, a new valve will cost you a lot less than $1,000.
Oh hell yeah! and Joey, you write commercial loans too, right?
I do not do commercial. I only do residential retail, but I do work with investors who buy up to 4 units.
All right, we'll cut that part out of the broadcast.
Yeah.
No, not that.
It's just a different. It's a totally type of different transaction.
Yeah.
Right.
As a matter of fact, Joey, we were mentioning this earlier as far as the differences. Depending on where you're looking, what constitutes residential and what constitutes commercial. So,
Good point.
For an inspector, there's one standard. For conventional versus having to go for a commercial loan, it's another standard. For title, yet another standard. If you're talking about whether you have to comply with all of the provisions of the Chicago Residential Landlords and Tenants Ordinance, yet another standard. So that must. It's an interesting, I suppose, minefield to navigate to figure out how am I going to finance this? Is it residential or commercial? How am I dealing with this from a title perspective? ... etc.
And then, if you don't mind, Noah, share with me a little bit about the finances and that, how things are different once we get over 4 units.
Yeah, so like for me personally, like we specialize in 5+, and our average deal size is probably like the 32 unit courtyards that you see all over Chicago. We see a ton of deals like that. But I was saying to these guys earlier that there's a big difference from an investor standpoint from 4 to 5 units because of the lending that they can get on it. When you're in the 1 to 4 unit space, you can put a 30-year loan on it, and it's looked at as just the value of the real estate is based off of other comps that have sold, other deals that have sold that are similar to that, other 4 units that have sold, and that's what an appraiser is going to be looking at when they decide the value of it. They're not particularly interested with the income that your investment puts off there. Whereas if you go into the 5-unit plus game, you're getting a different kind of loan, a commercial loan, which typically are 5 to 10 years. There is some newer loans that are out there these days, but historically 5 to 10 years, and those are based much more heavily on the income that the building is generating. So if you actually go into a deal like that, you buy it and you increase your rent by $50 a unit, that can exponentially increase the value of your building, which can allow you to put more debt on your building and maybe pull cash out in a transaction that you wouldn't have been able to do in a 2 to 4 unit deal.
I want to get back to that. I'm going to interrupt.
Yeah.
No, are you willing to help people if they have questions? Do you charge for talking to people on the phone?
No, always happy to talk to whoever.
How do people get hold of you? Give us the rundown on your company again, and if they do have questions about getting into the investment, the multifamily unit investment, how do they get hold of you?
Yeah, the best way is just to go to kaisergroup.com, and that's KISER group.com, and you'll be able to find me on there with all my contact info.
Yeah, and your phone number, let's give that out over the air. Write it down if you're ready.
That is 630-209-3622.
Sounds good. And Patrick, you've done quite a few. I don't know, what percentage of your transactions are multifamily?
It really depends on the year, but perhaps 1 in 10 is
That's
is a
still pretty
multifamily.
big, considering the amount of houses and everything else that moves.
Perhaps. I don't know. I don't know what other lawyers' numbers look like. So, over the years, I've transacted, or I've had enough of these come in the door that you learn what the dance moves are, and there's definitely distinct characteristics of a multifamily transaction as opposed to a transaction where someone's buying the home they're going to that they're going to live in.
Absolutely. And I know that you coach people and you answer whatever questions they have on their plate. How do people get a hold of you to ask you any of these questions?
You can call or text 773-632-8330.
Thank you. And Joey, same thing. I know you're a great asset, and I really appreciate you doing this with me. How do people get hold of you?
Yeah, Joey Matthews, the VA Loan Nerd, can be reached at 630-235-2405 or on all the social medias at the VA Loan Nerd. And I just talked in the third person, feel really weird about it.
Sounds good. Noah, you were mentioning, and Joey as well, maybe the two of you could tag team this answer. You mentioned that the mortgages are for 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to assume this is like a balloon type mortgage where they still give you a payment as if it's a 30-year mortgage, and then you either have to refinance or do something else different, or do they set it up where you got to actually pay this off in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so it's amortized, typically anywhere from 20 to 30 years. I'd say that most typically I see 25-year AM schedules on these. So your payment is as though you were paying it off over 25 years, but after 5 years, you usually need to go out and get a new loan, refinance it, or put new debt on the deal.
And how common is that? I mean, is that like the vast majority of the mortgages are done that way, or?
That is a lot in the space that we're in. You also see quite a bit of Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae financing, and that's they call non-recourse financing, which is typically 10 years, but there's also some variance there as well.
Yeah, you're usually not talking about conventional loans from like a retail lender. My experience with my clients who are investing in multifamily residential is they'll have a relationship with perhaps a smaller bank where they may even be working closely with one of the loan officers, and they'll be investing in a portfolio of real estate, and you might see things like prepayment penalties, which I would never expect to see in a conventional loan.
I thought those were all outlawed pretty much on every loan, isn't it?
Well, on a conventional loan, they've got very, very strict rules on what you can do and what you can't do as far as that kind of lending. These kinds of loans are meant for a more sophisticated kind of borrower, and once you get out of the space of a consumer versus an investor, investors, they do not have the same protections that a consumer would have, because it is assumed at that point that you are at a level of sophistication that that's not necessary. So it's the difference between someone who's going to maybe transact 2, 3, 4, 5 times a primary residence, as opposed to someone that's going to buy 2 properties a month.
It goes really hard on saying knowledge is power, isn't it? And it could cost you a lot of money or save you a lot of money.
Well, and it was thankfully it's far enough in the rear view that I have not seen it in a long time. But in the bad old days of before the Great Recession, you would see sometimes prepayment penalties on a conventional loan. I did see balloon payments on a second on a conventional loan. These kinds of things existed, and for a good reason, they don't anymore.
Outstanding. So some of the things that we were talking about earlier, and a lot of understanding how everything works, you have to understand the jargon, which is kind of like why I like getting so many people from different expertise on here. You were using the term legacy tenant. Can one of you two guys tell me what that means?
Sure, yeah. A legacy tenant is just, if I buy a building, there are tenants that live in the building already from the previous ownership. And so a legacy tenant is just a tenant that was part of the previous ownership, and then they're going to continue on during my ownership as well.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit, when you buy occupied real estate, you are buying the real estate with the occupants. They don't clear the building out or do anything other than assign the leases to you, give you any security deposits there might be. They will prorate the rent for the month. So if I'm closing on the 15th, if I've collected all the rent for that month, I would then hand over half of the rent to that buyer, because they will then be the owners of the property for the remainder of that month.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I would think that you would want to buy a building that is fully occupied.
It depends what your strategy is. For the most part, it's a good thing. Most people are buying buildings because they are interested in the amount of money that the building makes. And so the tenant's rent is the main thing that makes a building money. It can be a bad thing, or I guess, a challenge if, let's say that you buy a building where the current tenants are paying $1,000 and that unit could rent in today's market for $2,000.
That's a big difference.
So then you have a tenant in there that was getting a great deal because they signed their lease 10 years ago, and then you as the new landlord may look at that as an opportunity to push rents to current market levels.
How long does a typical lease go?
1 year?
Yeah, I'd say in Chicago 1 year is pretty standard.
So you just mentioned 10 years, and that's what made me ask that question. Does it happen where somebody has a 10-year lease where you can't change it if you buy a building, or this is one of those things that you need to know?
That is highly unlikely, but more so it is possible, though. I mean, you can sign any lease that you wanted to, and that lease would supersede the sale of the building. It would run with the sale of the building. But for the most part, the reason why that rent would still be at the same level as 10 years ago is maybe the prior owner was just happy with the tenant. They just had no reason to push the rent. They would rather, give that tenant, maybe that tenant was a great asset for the building. They kept things clean and they were nice, nice to deal with, sort of a deal. So you didn't need to push the rents because your basis in the deal was much less than when you sell it to the new person who now owns the building for 3 times as much as you paid for it, and they're not able to offer the same, rent concessions that you'd been giving for 10 years.
Having good tenants has tremendous value.
Go on.
You only have to have one bad tenant to realize how important that is.
Mm-hmm. What would be a bad tenant? I mean, obviously somebody doesn't pay their rent or something like that, but what else would be a bad tenant?
Someone who maybe is engaged in a drug enterprise, wouldn't want that person renting
that was very politically well said. I give you a big attaboy on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an obvious one. Someone who's abusing the property, someone who is causing, a good example would be, let's say I have a 6-unit building and I have a no smoking policy in the lease, but somebody decides that they are going to smoke cigarettes in the building, and all of my neighbors are complaining, and I have really 2 crummy options at that point. One is to evict the person who's smoking cigarettes, or to tell my other tenants to grit and bear it until the smoker's lease term is over. Those are both bad scenarios, and so these are just a couple of many examples, and Noah, I would imagine you would have more specific examples as opposed to my hypotheticals.
No, I mean, I would just echo everything you're saying. I mean, having a good tenant is a very, very valuable asset to a building, because having a bad tenant is such a problem with a building. And when you have, if you have a 30-unit building and you have 29 good tenants, but one tenant, like your scenario, happens to be engaged in a drug enterprise or something like that.
Like that too.
You start to see more people engaged in the drug enterprise start hanging around the building, and then the other 29 tenants don't want those sort of people, so they decide that they're going to move out of the building, and then the building starts to lose occupancy, and you get other characters in the building that maybe you didn't want there, and so just that one negative sort of aspect of the building starts spreading very quickly. In that said, I mean, like, to the point of not, having a building and not pushing the rents to current market levels, it's a, classic one in the hand or two in the bush scenario, where it's like, I know what I have here. I have a good tenant. They may be paying less, or I could go get somebody who says they're going to pay more, and maybe I sign a lease and they choose not to pay their rent, or they choose to, leave my water running and flood the unit or something like that. There's a lot of unknown risks that go into every decision like that.
I can see that. Yeah, we're pouring something down the toilet and things. We do have a question, from one of our watchers here. David Engel asked, do they switch from annual to month-to-month after the first agreement, or do you always go with another one-year lease?
I'll field that question. It sounds like a law question. So from a legal perspective,
It depends. I know that this is going to come with I don't know.
you've heard me answer yes or no, but it's a rare one. So yeah, if you sign a 12-month written lease, once that lease term expires, it does revert to a month-to-month. Now, that's why it's important to, when you renew, or when you have a tenant whose lease term is coming up, to get them to sign another one-year lease. A lot of people don't want to mess with the paperwork. It's a little extra work for what are you getting? You're getting really the same thing. They're going to pay rent either way. But paperwork is not about situations that work out fine. Paperwork is about when things start to go wrong.
It goes haywire, absolutely.
And you can't go back and change the past and bring that in and magically have paperwork that's suddenly in effect. You've got to manage that with a forward-looking thought. So yes, the answer to the question is, legally speaking, yes. But the way to address that is to make sure that you do have them sign renewal leases before the expiration of each lease term. Now, I'll add one more thing, because in Chicago and in Cook County, as of June of last year, there are landlord-tenant ordinances, and there are time frames that you need to make sure that you are abiding by. And if you are a landlord in Chicago or plan on being one, absolutely familiarize yourself with the RLTO, the Residential Landlord and Tenant Ordinance.
Say that again, please.
Familiarize yourself with the Chicago Residential Landlord and Tenant Ordinance. Just Google it. You'll find, you'll go down that rabbit hole. In Cook County, and this is fairly new, like I said, June of 2021, there is a Cook County Residential Tenant and Landlord Ordinance. They switched the two just to make sure that tongue twister is even more difficult.
Are they close to each other,
Yes, but with some important differences. In both cases, if you are in Chicago, Evanston, or Mount Prospect, they have their own, and that supersedes Cook County. If you are elsewhere in Cook County, you need to know about the Cook County one. If all of that sounds very confusing, 773-632-8330, because it is confusing.
Say it again. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm glad that you will, and you don't charge to talk to people on the phone, do you?
No.
And you're free for all your services, right?
Charlie, it depends always. No,
In fact, if I remember right, Patrick, don't you do free law for everything? You get free legal advice on everything?
And I
I love you, man. No, I get it. We all have to make money, but doing the right thing and helping somebody making good decisions is a good thing, and that always has its reward. The more we give, givers gain, the more things come back and help. And I believe in that, and I know you do.
Givers gain. Where have I heard that?
A little bit on the B&I stuff.
Well, and look, if you're on the landlord side of things, these landlord and tenant ordinances are going to feel onerous. All you got to do is get outside of Cook County, and all of a sudden it's more of a landlord oriented, or even leave the state and everything changes. But making sure that you understand what these restrictions are, what these rules are, it will lead to better landlord and tenant experiences overall. If the landlords are respecting the rules and the tenants feel respected, to my opinion, it's going to end up in a better landlord-tenant experience overall in Chicago and Cook County.
The secret to peace is respect of thy neighbor.
Good fences.
Yeah, good fences too. Okay, that's actually written on Mexico's currency, and that's why I remember something like that. Right? What percent do you? I know you have a pretty good portfolio, Noah. Do you keep everybody on their lease, or are there people that you let run month to month and you don't renew?
We for my personal stuff, we try to keep everybody on a lease, and we do that because we like to know, what's going to be expected further in the future, so we can predict, our income and what's going to come from that building. Not all landlords have that philosophy. There are landlords that actually prefer to keep their tenants on a month-to-month lease because, let's say that you have a bad tenant. You can just say, all right, 30 days, you're out. I just don't want to deal with it anymore.
But I thought that the laws here in Chicago and Cook County protect them, don't they, or no?
I was getting to that. In Chicago and Cook County, it's not quite that simple if the tenant decides that they want to stay in, but at least they don't have a lease that says that they are, able to stay in for the next 10 months if you as a landlord decide that you don't want them there. That said, it also can be beneficial for a tenant as well, because some tenants, maybe they're looking to buy a home and they don't want to be on a year-long lease. They want the flexibility to say, I can walk away next month if they want. And so there's pluses and minuses to doing it both ways, but I would say the very vast majority of people try to keep them on a year-long lease, but it's not unusual at all, for the deals that we broker to see a landlord just let it lapse to month, and I've seen people let that ride for years. Like we talked about earlier, a tenant that's been there for 10 years, but they haven't actually had a lease since, 10 years.
Yeah, not everyone follows best practices, and in fact, I would generally expect to see that the best practices haven't been followed in those respects. And there's tools in your arsenal if you do have even if you do have a written lease. Certainly, you want to have whatever your expectation is of the tenant needs to be in the written lease, so that you can evict someone even if they're paying if they are breaking the rules. It's going to be more complicated. The process is slightly different, but you do have that ability. And then if you can, if there's no guarantee, sometimes work out something called cash for keys, which is something I advise and costs me money every time I give that advice because it doesn't usually involve a lawyer. But it's, no, you might be familiar with it.
Yeah, it's really the concept of, do I evict my tenant? And if my tenant wants to go through the eviction process, that's a very challenging process for a landlord, and if a tenant uses all the resources that are available to them, that can be a 6-month long process, and it can be very expensive for a landlord to evict a tricky tenant. And by expensive, I mean thousands and thousands of dollars to get a tenant who isn't paying or isn't respecting their lease out. Or maybe you have a tenant who hasn't paid in 6 months, and instead of evicting them, you just say, hey, here's $500, just leave. And so you're actually paying the person who wasn't paying you to leave in an effort to avoid going through the legal process with them, and they call that cash for keys. Here's cash, give me your keys.
Noah, how do people get hold of you if they want to ask more questions on this?
Phone number, cell phone is 630-209-3622.
And Patrick, how do they get hold of you?
773-632-8330.
And Joey, please give your contact information.
Hi, Joey Matthews, 630-235-2405.
I got a question for Joey, actually.
I know it has to do with his voice, that's for sure.
No, there's no question about that voice. So, Joey, help me understand. So you said that you can write a conventional loan for up to 4 units. How does the amount of rent that somebody can expect to collect, how does that affect their ability to qualify for a loan?
Oh boy, I'm sure glad you asked. No, well, it's actually, so a lot of times buying an investment property is your first property, especially if you're VA. If you're a VA buyer, we can qualify rents as income for that property based on the rent schedule that the appraiser provides.
100%?
So really, they use 75% of the rents collected.
That's a lot.
So if your mortgage is $4,000, I'm sorry, if your mortgage is $3,000 and we're showing $4,000 for rents, we can show $3,000 in income on that. So your debt ratios are completely offset for that purchase. So the only thing we have to worry about is assets and reserves. So a lot of people don't realize it, but yeah, buying an investment property as your first purchase can be a huge, or an income property, I guess.
Wait a minute, I need a better understanding of that. I always thought that when you take your income, that they can only use 33% or 50% of that income as far as your loan ratios go. Did I just hear you right, or did I mishear you saying that if that rental income is $3,000, you could use 100% of that towards the building?
So no, if the rent schedules are showing that the building is bringing in $4,000, we can use 75% of that, right? So that would put us at $3,000 that we can use as rental income to offset your full mortgage payment.
On top of the income you earn from...
On top of the income you earn, correct.
That's super interesting. I love that. We do have a couple of questions, that are people that are listening right now. And one might be more of a comment, but I wouldn't mind getting a response from one of you guys. April, she says month-to-month is good if they started with a longer lease, but I think it would be a pain in the butt to start with month-to-month unless it was furnished, because Lord knows moving and unpack your stuff is hard to deal with and stuff like that. So normally do you bring somebody in as a month-to-month right away, or is there always going to be some sort of a lease?
Yeah, I mean, normally I'd say there's going to be a lease because the turnover costs are a pretty underrated cost in multifamily in general, and it just, when a tenant moves out of your apartment or your house or whatever it may be, it costs you money to paint it, it costs you money to clean it, it costs you money.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it gets expensive. So if you're saying that, you, tenant, want to move into this unit, I want to make sure that the amount of money I just invested into getting this unit nice for you is worth it, because, you have to at least pay 12 months worth of rent to make sure that amount of money was worth it for me to invest into, making the unit nice for you. So it pretty rare to see a month-to-month from the jump.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
I think you'd get if you were getting a short-term renter, you'd get a premium. Number one, because of that. But I do want to perhaps clarify, when we talk about month-to-month, a month-to-month lease is one that runs indefinitely, meaning that it goes until either the landlord or the tenant says, I don't want it to go anymore. Now that's a very oversimplified way of describing it. There's specific rules about how one goes about ending that month-to-month, but I'm not going to get into that because that'll be another 5 minutes of me.
No, that's all right. And maybe we will get into it. So I still want to give a second just so I can put a plug in for our company. My name is Charlie Belfontaine. I own Chicagoland Home Inspectors, and our phone number is 312-544-9180. And one of the subjects I do want to talk again on are savvy investors that end up doing their own inspection. They don't hire an outside company to do this stuff, which is not necessarily a bad idea. It's actually a pretty good idea if you have the knowledge. And we do have a school where we train home inspectors, and most of our online training, and especially the pre-level, I can get that to our listeners for free. And that school is Home Inspection University of Illinois, and that website is HIUIL.com. Again, that's HIUIL.com. And, I just want to, again, give a shout-out to our guest here. Noah Birk is a very smart multifamily real estate agent that I admire, and I'm thrilled to have you on the show. Patrick Loftus is probably one of the smartest attorneys that I've ever met who deals with real estate. And again, I'm always thrilled having you here. And Joey,
Is that despite even despite my festive outfit?
I love the hat. For those of you that are listening Saturday morning, you don't know what it's like. If you do a search on Facebook for the HomeBuyers Hour, then also on our business YouTube channel, which we are going to be moving these to have our own website, the HomeBuyers Hour. We're going to be moving it to our own YouTube channel soon. But we do these live, and if you're watching us, you can always ask questions through the system, and we promise that we're going to address everything and answer them. And then the world's okayest mortgage person, and I only say that lovingly because he says it lovingly, Joey Matthews. I want to thank all you guys for being here again. I did remember talking about some issues, not only getting the house or getting the apartment building, but even managing it, throughout the time afterwards. And you guys threw out words like overflowing garbage, porches, lintels. Noah, can you give me a little bit of detail when people use those three lovely words? What are they talking about?
So I think what you're kind of alluding to are what I would call soft costs, and these are unexpected expenses that pop up inside of owning a building. And
you do have to budget for this, right?
You do, and you should budget for it. And the more sophisticated that a buyer is or an owner is, the more likely they are to account for things like lintels or like garbage fees. And by garbage fees, I mean currently Chicago seems to be going around and writing a lot of tickets for overflowing garbage or garbage that isn't overflowing. Things like that.
Yeah, and how do you prove that it was or it wasn't?
Because it's gone. Yeah.
Yeah, I would expect if you own a building, you're probably going to get two $500 tickets a year. Just on that, if you get more, you should probably think about whether your garbage dumpster is big enough. But
yeah, definitely.
I think they would send those tickets at least on Valentine's Day and Christmas. At least they're gonna make a pink letter romantic or something,
But on a more macro level of the question, it's a question of your soft costs when owning a building, and it's important to make sure that you underwrite a building conservatively and you account for all of those things that could go wrong or could pop up as an expense that a lot of less sophisticated investors don't think about. A lot of people don't think about what happens when the lintels above my windows start to rust out. How much does that cost me? And if it costs you $1,000 or $2,000 to replace those lintels, and you have 50 of them on your building, were you allocating $50,000 or $100,000? Did you have that set aside? And these are little things that you want to try to get out in front of so that you can save for a rainy day. Going back to is it a surprise or is it a problem? If it's a problem, you were ready for it. If it's a surprise, you got to figure out where to come up with $50,000 or $100,000 that you weren't planning on.
We had a past client. I'm sorry, Perry. I'm going to jump in on the lintel things because it's such an emotional deal to me. I got so upset over this.
Charlie's triggered.
I got triggered.
Let's lintels.
But it was. I had a past client that wanted $40,000 from us for failing to tell them that all their lintels needed to be replaced. All right, and the bottom line is this: and I guess it's important that we understand what happens with lintels. So if they're not protected and water gets to them, they're going to rust. They are steel.
What's a lintel? I don't know that everyone knows that.
No, I love it. So we use the term lintel, as we use the term header when it comes to lintel. But in all reality, what we're talking about either is a brick veneer, which is a single width, or one stack of brick on the outside, or even if it's a full brick building, it's when we have either wood or steel, something that's going to support the brick that's above it. A lot of people don't realize that piece of metal, that lintel that's supporting the brick above it, it only supports a triangle shape over the top of that lintel. So as I was mentioning earlier, when steel begins to rust, it expands, it gets bigger. And there's really 3 stages of lintel failure that you should be aware of, because not all lintels have to be replaced today. They're not going to be failing instantly, and you might as well let them run their lifespan unless you want to stay cosmetic on things. So the first one, you're going to see a 3 to 6 inch crack just left and right of the window, and it's going to be straight. There's not step cracking. It doesn't go into the brick. That means that the lintel itself has been It started to rust, it started to expand, it started to lip. The second stage is when the cracks go up and away from the windows from each side. Now what's happening is we're actually lifting up on that triangle above the windows, and we're going to start getting stress cracks, which is that step cracking pattern that's going up and away. And then finally, when the lintel is actually failing, that's when the middle part of the lintel is settling. Those cracks are going to switch from going up and away to coming across, and you're going to see a triangle over the top of the window. Once you see that triangle over the top of the window, the next stage is actual collapse, all right? And that's what we're going to wait for. So we had a house, I think it was up in Algonquin. We documented that there were stage one, the first cracks in the lintels. We felt it was minor. We documented it as such. This client went ahead and they got a mason out there who says, oh no, all these things need to be replaced. There's 20 windows, $2,000 a window, and it's going to cost you $40,000. My client calls me up and says, this is a problem. We get out there right away. I'm like, I could tell you right now, I can get you 200 home inspectors out here that are not going to think this is a big deal, all right? And that you got another 30, 40, 50 years before they're going to have to be replaced, all right? We told you about this. We gave you our opinion. We still believe it. We're going to stand by this, that it's a minor issue. But if you want to go ahead and hire him to do it, feel free. That's up to you. But I think he's selling you something you don't need, all right? And Patrick is nodding his head yes to me. And what have you found with these lintels, on how bad are they to where people need to get them fixed?
Well, I mean, it's lintels are one thing amongst 100 things that can fail within a building, and
Porches, decks, lots of things.
Lintels just happen to be something that people, the fact that we had to define what it is it's something that people don't often think about, and it's something that's expensive, and so. One important budget to make sure you have is, called a CapEx budget, which stands for capital expenditures, money that you're going to have to put into the building at some point in time.
Sounds like kind of an escrow fund?
Like a reserve account.
A reserve account.
And so like you're planning ahead, and the kind of it's the big ticket items that, can make or break a deal for you. And so when you have things like lintels that don't necessarily add value to your building, but they're important to have done, because if you don't have them done, then it kills the value of your building because the building starts to physically collapse. But, you have to plan on doing those sort of things and making sure that you're on top of all that to make sure that the building is in good shape.
Man, I could talk about this stuff all day long, and, just this hour always just goes by too darn fast.
It does. There's so many things, and I almost feel bad that we didn't hear too much from Joey today, because I think this is, bigger than what he's normally used to getting into. But the 4 or 5, Joey, real quick, because we really only have 1 minute left. One piece of solid advice to somebody for getting their paperwork together if they want to invest in a 3 or 4 unit building.
Obviously talk to Noah, but you got to make sure that you have cash flow. You got to look at depreciation in a market like this when rates are higher.
Do you help people with that, Joey?
I usually don't need to. A lot of them are more savvy, but if it's a first-time buyer, I will, or a first-time investor, I will. I have one that I'm doing right now where it's their first place they're buying. Their cash flow and $600 after expenditures, which is insane.
It is insane.
That's nice.
So,
all right.
Yeah.
I do have to cut you off. I got a few thank yous that we have to get out here before we wrap things up. First of all, Devin Tingle, our producer, a special thank you to you. We really appreciate everything you do. Bernie, I love you. He's our #1 listener. Again, my name is Charlie. You're listening to the HomeBuyers Hour. Another thank you to Noah Birk. And with Patrick Loftus and Joey Matthews, this is Charlie Balfontaine, and I am out.